Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for just a moment and try to imagine the single worst thing that could happen to a child. Not the ordinary fears of childhood, not the things that make small hearts race in the dark hours before morning, the shadow behind the wardrobe or the creak on the stair, the bad dream that dissolves the moment the light comes on. Something deeper and more permanent than those ordinary terrors. Something that cannot be turned off when the sun rises. Picture the moment a child realizes that something is fundamentally, irrevocably wrong with them. Not wrong in the way of illness, which might be cured. Wrong in the way of being, in the way of identity itself. Wrong in a way that cannot be confessed to the people they love, because confessing means the end of everything they have ever known. The end of their family. The end of their safety, the end, quite possibly, of their life. Hold that image. Now carry it forward 10,000 years and carry it into a universe that has forgotten what gentle means. Carry it into a galaxy where entire civilizations are processed through the machinery of endless war, the way grain is processed through a mill, where the stars themselves bleed, where the membrane separating physical reality from something far older and far more hostile than the human mind was designed to comprehend, is torn and fraying at every seam. Carry that child and that terror into a universe that runs on suffering as a primary fuel source. That is where we begin today. In the 41st millennium of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, to be born a Psyker is to inherit one of the most elaborate, crushing, and quietly devastating fates that the lore has ever conceived. Not a fate imposed by a single villain or a specific act of malice. A fate imposed by a system. By a machine so old and so large and so deeply embedded in the architecture of human civilization that the people operating it no longer fully think of it as a choice. It is just what is done. It is just how things work. It is just the price of keeping the lights on in a galaxy that wants very badly to go dark. The black ships, the Psyker tithe, the voyage to terror. What waits at journey's end? This is that story. All of it. From the very first flicker of psychic awareness awakening in an ordinary child living an ordinary life, through years of hiding and fear and the constant pressure of a secret that could never be shared, and through capture and chains and a voyage through the most hostile dimension in the universe, packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other frightened people who share the same terrible secret, all the way to the blinding, humbling halls of the Emperor's own palace, and the decision made there that will determine whether this particular person lives on to serve, or simply stops being entirely. Welcome to the channel. I want to tell you something that took me a very long time to fully absorb, and it is this. In all of Warhammer 40,000, with all its galaxy-swallowing conflicts, and its demon-haunted worlds, and its engines of destruction that dwarf anything human imagination normally produces, few things are quite as quietly and persistently horrifying as the simple institutional machinery of how the Imperium of man manages its Psykers. The Space Marines are dramatic and striking. The Chaos Gods are ancient and terrible. But the Black Ships, the Psyker tithe, the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls to keep a psychic lighthouse burning across the stars. These things are the machinery that runs underneath everything else. They are the price of the Imperium's existence, paid daily in human beings. Let us begin at the very beginning, which is also, fittingly, a birth. Part 1. Born different. The first stirrings of power. Humanity's relationship with psychic ability is old, ancient beyond any comfortable reckoning. The first confirmed historical records of humans manifesting genuine psionic powers appear at around the 22nd millennium in the timeline of the setting, roughly 9,000 years before the story's present day. Before that, nothing. No documented cases that survived the historical record. No established tradition, no institutional memory of how to handle it. Then, seemingly without warning, simultaneously and without obvious cause, across nearly every human-settled world in the galaxy, children began to be born different. This was not a small thing. It was the opening movement of what the setting frames as humanity's slow, agonizing, possibly doomed evolution into a fully psychic species. The Eldari, humanity's ancient and diminished predecessors as galactic powers, completed this evolution long ago, and the consequences of it were so catastrophic that their empire collapsed, and in so doing created an entirely new chaos god. The lesson of the Eldari is one that some factions in the setting are aware of, and many are not. And the lesson is simply this: becoming a psychic species is a process that can destroy everything if it is not managed perfectly, and perfect management may not be possible. Humanity in the 41st millennium is in the middle of this process. Each generation sees more Psykers born than the last. The rate of psychic emergence across human populations has been increasing since those first documented cases 9,000 years ago, and the opening of the Great Rift in the setting's recent history has accelerated this increase dramatically. More Psykers are born every year. The Black Ship's holds grow more crowded. The machine runs harder, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. We were talking about a child. The mutation that creates a Psyker does not announce itself with drama. Not initially. A Psyker is not born visibly altered, whilst the physical body of a Psyker, particularly before their powers have fully awakened, is in the vast majority of cases completely indistinguishable from the body of any ordinary human being. No extra eye, no aura of visible energy crackling around them, no sigil burned into the flesh by forces unknown. A Psyker child looks like any other child. They breathe the same air, eat the same food, play the same games, cry at the same things. They have parents who love them, and they have fears at night, and they have wishes for their future. The difference lives in the soul, not as metaphor, as literal fact. Every living thing in the 40,000 universe that possesses consciousness also possesses what might be described as a presence in the warp. The warp. That vast and terrible dimension of psychic energy that underlies and interpenetrates physical reality is not empty. It is not nothing. It is a realm of pure emotion and psychic force, shaped by the cumulative mental activity of every living, thinking creature that has ever existed. Every mind in the material universe casts a shadow in the Imperium, a reflection of itself, a presence. The warp, from this perspective, is the collective unconscious of all conscious life, vast and tangled and seething with the residue of every fear and desire and hatred and joy that has ever been felt by anything that felt things. An ordinary human's presence in the warp is modest. The term used in various sources is illuminating in its plainness. A candle, a steady, quiet light, enough to be there. Not enough to attract serious attention from whatever things drift through the psychic currents of the Imperium. The warp is full of entities that notice presences, that feed on them, or are drawn to them, or attempt to use them as doorways into the material universe. But a candle is not bright enough to reliably draw the predatory attention of anything significant. A Psyker burns like a signal fire. From the moment the psychic mutation activates, which typically happens somewhere between the ages of 10 and 20, with exceptions at both ends of that range, a Psyker's presence in the warp intensifies enormously. It is not a gradual process in most cases. It is a threshold crossing. One day the person is a candle. Then something changes, something in the deep architecture of their neurology and their soul, and suddenly they are a fire, and a bright, strong, unmistakable light in a realm full of things that have been searching for exactly this kind of brightness. From the perspective of every entity in the Imperium that registers such things, a Psyker's awakening is like watching a torch be lit in a dark room. Everything in the dark room notices. The powers themselves, when they begin to manifest in the material world, can take almost any form imaginable, and several that are difficult to imagine at all. Telekinesis. the ability to move physical objects through thought alone, which begins as uncontrolled bursts and can develop into the precision of a fine tool. Pyrokinesis, the generation and control of fire, which in early manifestation tends to express itself as random and frightening ignition events rather than anything deliberate. Telepathy, the awareness of other minds, sometimes subtle as emotional resonance, and sometimes overwhelming as a complete transparency of other people's thoughts. Precognition, flashes of probable futures, discontinuous and unreliable, like receiving the middle pages of a book you have never read. Biomancy, the ability to influence biological matter, including one's own body, in ways that range from accelerated healing to more disturbing applications, and many others, subtler or stranger, that resist classification. What is almost always true of early manifestation is that it is not controlled. The abilities emerge in response to strong emotion, particularly fear, anger, and grief, and they emerge without the discipline or awareness that would make them manageable. As a child who accidentally causes every piece of glass in the house to shatter during a moment of intense emotional distress is not making a choice. A teenager who discovers they can hear the surface thoughts of the people around them and cannot turn this off is not choosing to violate anyone's privacy. A young adult who wakes from a nightmare to find that the room around them has been spontaneously rearranged by forces they cannot identify is not doing anything intentional. They are simply being what they are, for the first time, without any framework for understanding it. Here is the thing that makes this so devastating in the specific context of the Imperium. These people are not born into a society that has any constructive relationship with what they are. The Imperium of Man is a civilization built on the suppression of psychic ability at the individual level and the ruthless exploitation of it at the institutional level. Ordinary Imperial citizens are raised, from childhood, with a very specific and consistently reinforced understanding of what a witch is. The word witch in the Imperium is not a folk superstition. It is a legal category and a social designation, and in many communities, practically a declaration of species. It means, this person is dangerous. This person is not like us. This person has a connection to the warp that makes them a potential doorway for exactly the things that destroyed worlds during the Age of Strife, the period of galactic history when uncontrolled psychic activity contributed to the collapse of human civilization across the entire galaxy. The Imperial Creed, as the quasi-religious ideology that serves as the Imperium's ideological foundation, reinforces this consistently. In the temples and cathedrals that dot every imperial world, in the sermons that form the backbone of civic instruction for billions, Psykers are discussed as a temptation and a threat, as something that the righteous citizen must be vigilant against recognizing, reporting, and not sheltering. The stigma is not incidental to the Imperium's handling of Psykers. It is structural. It is how the collection system maintains its legitimacy. If ordinary people saw Psykers primarily as victims rather than threats, they would not report them. They would hide them. And the consequences of a world full of unsanctioned Psykers who are hidden rather than collected are, in the setting's terms, genuinely catastrophic. So the child who discovers their powers discovers them in a world where those powers are treated as corruption, as witchcraft, as the mark of something that should be feared and reported and removed. The emotional architecture that any young person builds around who they are and what they want and what their life might mean gets constructed on a foundation that is now, suddenly and permanently, contaminated with the knowledge of what they are and what happens to people like them. The specific phenomenology of early psychic manifestation, the experiences that come with it, make the isolation worse rather than better. Many psychers develop a passive sensitivity to the emotional states of people around them as an involuntary first symptom, long before any more dramatic ability emerges. They begin to feel, with uncomfortable clarity, here's what the people nearest to them actually feel. Not just what those people's faces show or what their words say, but the unfiltered, unedited emotional truth underneath. This is not a pleasant gift. Most people's emotional lives, experienced from the inside by someone who cannot turn off the signal, are complicated and contradictory and frequently unkind. The developing psyker, who cannot stop receiving these signals from family members and neighbors and schoolmates, often becomes withdrawn, quiet, overwhelmed in social situations, prone to sudden and inexplicable emotional responses that mirror things happening inside people they are physically near. The people around them notice this strangeness before they can name it. Something is different about this one. Something wrong. The community's emotional immune system activates, very quietly and without malice, but inevitably. Friendships cool. Adults find reasons to steer their children away. The family starts to feel the sideways glances from the neighbors, the too brief conversations, the invitations that stop coming. The child is isolated at exactly the moment they most need connection, because the very abilities that are emerging are abilities that make human connection terrifying and exhausting. The religious context of the Imperium amplifies all of this. The Imperial Creed has existed for 10,000 years, and in that time has produced a comprehensive mythology around the nature of psychic ability that is taught to children almost from birth. The witch is a figure in this mythology with a specific and consistently portrayed set of characteristics. The witch is seductive and dangerous. The witch uses abilities that were meant to belong only to the emperor. The witch opens doors that should remain closed and lets in things that humanity was never designed to survive. The witch is not an unfortunate person burdened by a mutation they did not choose. The witch is a failure of will, a person who did not resist the temptation of power, who chose the warp over the emperor, who represents a spiritual defect rather than a biological one. A child who is developing psychic abilities and who has been raised with this mythological framework is not simply afraid of being caught. They are also afraid of what being caught might mean about them. If the witch is a spiritual failure, if psychic ability is a sign of corruption rather than a neutral biological mutation, and then the child is confronted with a specific and particular form of self-doubt. Am I this? Have I already failed? Is this what my soul looks like? The institutional indoctrination of the Imperium produces, in the very population the black ships are coming to collect, a deep and consistent tendency to interpret their own mutation as evidence of their own unworthiness. Some of them comply with the tithe out of genuine belief that the tithe is right and that they are the thing the tithe is correctly designed to manage. This is not a coincidence. It is the system working as intended. The Imperium cannot maintain a collection apparatus this large through physical enforcement alone. The social and psychological architecture that makes the system function, that produces compliance and reduces resistance. It is constructed through the 1,000-year project of the Imperial Creed's relationship with the concept of the witch. Make the collected feel that they deserve to be collected. Make the community around them feel that reporting them is the right and faithful thing to do. Make the whole apparatus of the tithe feel like something other than a massive institutional seizure of human beings for industrial purposes. This is the world the child wakes up into. This is the framework within which they will make every decision about who they are and what to do about it. An untrained psyker, drawing on the warp without any framework for managing the flow, is like trying to drink from a river with your bare hands. The water comes and comes and comes, and most of it goes everywhere, and occasionally it drowns you. The energy that flows into the psyker from the immaterium seeks release, and release tends to happen at the moments of greatest emotional intensity, the moments of anger or fear or grief, when the wall between the psyker's internal state and their expression of it becomes thin. These release events can take many forms. Localized distortions of temperature, objects moving or shattering without physical contact, lights flickering or exploding, animals reacting with sudden and extreme alarm to something only they perceive, people in the vicinity experiencing brief, shared hallucinations that all of them will later describe slightly differently, the way people describe the same car accident from different vantage points. These events cannot always be explained away, and the ones that cannot be explained away are the ones that bring official attention. Part 2. The world of the unsanctioned, existing in the cracks. Before we follow a Psyker onto a black ship, we need to understand the full texture of the existence they are leaving, because the horror of the black ships is not just the horror of what they are, it is also the horror of what they represent the end of, even when what they represent the end of was itself defined by fear and concealment and the constant threat of exposure. The formal legal position of an unsanctioned Psyker in the Imperium is that of a criminal. The law is absolute, ancient, and consistently enforced. All Psykers must be reported to the relevant authorities. All Psykers must submit to the tithe. All Psykers who fail to surrender themselves are, by definition, fugitives from imperial law, subject to immediate apprehension and, in certain circumstances, immediate execution. The law allows no exceptions for age, for demonstrated harmlessness, for community standing, for family position. The mutation is the mutation. The tithe is the tithe. A planetary governor who protects a family member from collection faces consequences that can extend to outright military intervention. A priest who shelters a gifted child in his congregation faces the same law. There are no loopholes. There is no appeal. From the Imperium's perspective, this absolutism has a genuine and internally consistent logic. The threat posed by an uncontrolled Psyker is not proportionate to their intentions. The most gentle and harmless person who ever lived, if they carry a sufficiently strong psychic mutation and remain unprotected by training or institutional control, can become a gateway for demonic incursion through no fault or choice of their own. The warp does not check whether you are a good person before it tries to push through the gap your bright soul creates in the fabric of reality. The entities that inhabit the Imperium do not discriminate between willing hosts and unwilling ones. The catastrophes that result from possession, from the breach of reality that a sufficiently powerful and uncontrolled Psyker can precipitate, are scale events. Not individual tragedies, world-ending events. The historical record of the Age of Strife is full of them. Worlds consumed by demonic incursion, populations enslaved by psychic predators, civilizations reduced to rubble by the accumulated consequences of too many unprotected, uncontrolled psychic individuals in too small a space. So the law is what it is, and the Psyker who survives outside it must operate in a world where almost everything is arranged against their survival. The practical shape of an unsanctioned Psyker's life, for those who manage to avoid collection for extended periods, is defined by management and concealment in equal measure. Every day is a negotiation between the need to exist in the world, to eat and work and maintain relationships, and participate in the ordinary business of living, and the absolute necessity of never attracting the specific kind of attention that ends in chains and a black ship. As the most dangerous moment for any Psyker who has gone undetected for years is the arrival of the black ship. But the time between those arrivals, the years and sometimes decades when the ship is elsewhere in its long circuit, is not safe. It is merely less actively hazardous. The Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's internal law enforcement, maintains extensive protocols for identifying potential Psykers through behavioral and circumstantial evidence, reports of unusual occurrences in specific locations, animals behaving oddly, localized temperature anomalies, reports from neighbors of strange sensations or disturbing dreams, witnesses to small, impossible events. All of these feed into a system that investigates and follows up, and sometimes, eventually, arrives at a specific door with specific questions. The Inquisition is more active still, particularly the Ordo Hereticus, whose mandate includes the identification and management of unsanctioned psychic activity within the Imperium. Inquisitors of this ordo often work with specialists, people specifically trained and equipped for the hunting of Psykers. Among the most effective of these hunting tools are the Psyhounds, themselves Psykers who have been trained and partially suppressed by the institutional apparatus, their abilities narrowed down to a single function: the sensing of other psychic presences. A Psyker can sense other Psykers. The bright signal fire of a psychic individual's warp presence is visible to any other individual who is sufficiently sensitive and who knows what to look for. Psi-hounds are essentially living detection instruments, individuals whose particular sensitivity has been focused and sharpened until they can walk through a populated district and tell you, with considerable precision, which building contains the thing you are looking for. Against this kind of detection, ordinary concealment, the concealment of behavior and social presentation, provides very little protection. A psyker who has trained themselves not to use their abilities, who lives with constant rigid self-suppression, dims their warp presence somewhat, but they cannot extinguish it. The fire burns whether they tend it or not. The suppression reduces its visibility. A sufficiently skilled psi-hound can still find them, for the psyker living outside the system. But the communities they can most safely inhabit are those where official scrutiny is lightest and institutional presence is most attenuated. The deep underhives of great hive cities are the canonical example. Labyrinthine sprawls of stacked habitation housing populations so dense that individual people can genuinely disappear into the mass, where the Arbites patrol but cannot comprehensively survey, where community ties are tight enough to protect secrets and loose enough to accommodate the strange. Frontier settlements far from administrative centers. Void stations and trading posts where transient populations make systematic surveillance difficult. The spaces between spaces, the gaps in the Imperium's enormous and imperfect bureaucratic coverage. Some of these unsanctioned psykers find their way into arrangements that provide a degree of protection through useful employment. Rogue traders, who operate in the outer reaches of human space, where the strict enforcement of imperial law is considerably more theoretical than practical, are known to maintain psykers in their retinues. The utility of a trained or even partially trained psyker in the context of interstellar trade and exploration is obvious enough that some rogue trader houses treat this as an acceptable operational risk. Criminal organizations similarly value what a psyker can offer, particularly telepaths who can sense deception and diviners whose foreknowledge of which transactions are likely to go wrong is worth considerable practical value. These arrangements are usually not equal partnerships. They are accommodations in which the psyker's protection is contingent on their continued usefulness, and in which the power differential is rarely in the psyker's favor. The internal experience of this existence, the day-to-day reality of being a hidden psyker in the Imperium, is one of persistent, low-grade psychological strain. The suppression of psychic ability is not merely a social performance. It requires active mental effort. The powers that manifest in response to strong emotion must be managed through the emotion itself, which means learning to modulate your own internal states with a precision and consistency that is not natural to human beings. Anger must be carefully ventilated before it builds to the threshold where the telekinetic force that accompanies it becomes visible. A fear must be managed through controlled breathing and deliberate cognitive redirection before the distortions of reality that fear produces in a strong psyker become obvious to the people nearby. Grief must be suppressed in ways that leave permanent marks on the psychological architecture. And all of this must be done alone. There are no support systems, no established communities of practice, no experienced psykers whose wisdom can be passed down. Every hidden psyker invents their management techniques from scratch, through trial and error, in isolation. The errors have consequences that range from embarrassing to fatal. Beyond the social and psychological cost, there is the spiritual and existential cost. The warp does not become less attentive because a psyker is trying not to use their abilities. In the entities that notice the psyker's bright presence when their powers first awakened have not stopped noticing. They are patient in a way that transcends human timescales. They probe at the edges of the psyker's defenses with curiosity and hunger, and in some cases, something that might be called intelligence. Dreams that feel too structured, too directed, as if they are being authored by something other than the dreamer's own sleeping mind. Waking moments of sudden and inexplicable terror with no discernible physical cause. The sensation, persistent and impossible to shake entirely, of being watched by something that cannot be looked at directly. The longer an untrained psyker uses their abilities, the more their psychic presence in the warp is established, the more consistently they are noticed. The greater the accumulation of subtle damage to the barrier between their mind and the Imperium. An untrained psyker who has been using their abilities for years to survive is not the same person, spiritually or psychically, as a psyker who was collected young and immediately entered the institutional framework. The years of unsupported contact with the warp leave marks. Some of them are merely psychological. Some of them are deeper than that, changes to the fundamental architecture of the psyker's connection to the Imperium that even the most skilled trainers of the Scholastica Psychana cannot fully undo. The possession process, when it begins, is not usually dramatic at first. It is gradual, incremental, a series of small concessions. A moment when the psyker finds themselves saying something they did not intend to say, as if a voice had briefly hijacked their tongue. A period of lost time, minutes or hours unaccounted for, during which the body has been somewhere and done something that the conscious mind has no access to. Impulses that feel like their own, but carry an unfamiliar emotional signature. Desire without the usual qualifications. Anger with an alien purity to it. These symptoms, if that is the right word for them, can be dismissed for a long time. The psyker wants to dismiss them. The psyker wants desperately to believe that they are still intact, that the years of careful management have worked, that the bright thing inside them has not yet attracted anything that cannot be dislodged. Sometimes they are right, often they are not. A fully possessed psyker is not simply a dangerous person who needs to be stopped. They are a living breach in the membrane between the material universe and the warp, through which additional entities can be drawn, through which the demonic influence can spread to other minds in the vicinity, through which reality itself can begin to deteriorate in ways that become rapidly self-reinforcing. The history of the setting is full of examples of what happens when a single, sufficiently powerful psyker, possessed by a sufficiently powerful demonic entity, is left unaddressed in a populated environment. Hive cities reduced to charnel houses, continents swept by waves of mass psychosis, planets that had to be destroyed from orbit to stop the spread. This is the mathematics that the Imperium uses to justify what it does. Individuals suffering against collective survival, one psyker's freedom against 10 billion ordinary people's continued existence. The math is brutal, and it is, within the logic of the setting, correct. And it does not make any of it less terrible for the people to whom it is applied. Part 3. The ships that swallow the stars. When the black ships come, there is a quality to the fear that spreads through a populated world when a black ship enters the system that is unlike any other category of fear that planetary populations regularly experience. Part of this is the rarity. Black ships visit worlds approximately once every 100 years. For most people alive when a ship arrives, this is their first experience of the collection event. They have only heard about it in the stories and warnings passed down through community memory, in the official statements from the Planetary Governor's Office, in the sermons of the ecclesiarchy that frame the tithe in language of honor and duty and sacred obligation to the emperor. The theoretical knowledge of what the black ships do is widespread. The direct experience of watching one arrive in orbit and begin its work is not something most people alive at the time will ever have had before. The Imperium's worlds are immeasurably varied in almost every physical and cultural respect, but the response to the black ships tends to be consistent in ways that suggest something more universal than cultural learning. The world goes quiet. Not silent, not the absence of all sound, but a particular kind of quietness that occupies the spaces between ordinary sounds. At a collective holding of breath that people experience without being able to explain why they are doing it. Communities that are ordinarily noisy and socially active become more contained. People spend more time indoors. Social gatherings contract in size. There is a period of communal anxiety that extends across the entire planetary population, even among the people who have no reason whatsoever to be specifically afraid of the collection. Because the arrival of the black ships is a reminder that the category of person who is specifically afraid of the collection exists and has always existed among them. Wars produce fear, plagues produce fear, economic collapse, natural disaster, orbital bombardment. These all generate fear with specific textures and specific behavioral responses. But the black ship produces something different, something more internally divided and more quietly corrosive. Because the black ship is not coming for everyone. It is coming for specific people who have been living among everyone else, and those specific people have often been known to their families and communities for years, even if the psychic nature of their difference was not formally acknowledged. The arrival of the black ship is the moment when everything that was known but not spoken becomes official, is categorized, is processed. It is the moment when the community's maintained fiction that the strange one is just strange, that the child who makes things move when she is upset is just a nervous child, that the old man whose cat never leaves his side and who sometimes knows things he should not know is just perceptive, dissolves completely. The black ship does not accept community fictions. The League of Black Ships is, by any metric used to assess such things, an extraordinary institution. Independent of the Imperial Navy, answering directly to the master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, it operates the second largest fleet in the entire galaxy. The true size of that fleet is classified information, known only to the very highest ranks of the organization. There are many thousands of these vessels. They are ancient. Most of them are far older than any other type of ship in regular Imperial service, their hulls layered with centuries of protective warding, their internal architecture refined by generations of operators for the specific and demanding task they perform. They travel in constant circuits, each ship visiting dozens of worlds before returning to Terra, pausing at each world for the collection and assessment and then moving on, never quite still, never quite at rest, always in motion. The ships are described in various sources as having a specific and unpleasant visual quality, like a void that blocks out the stars as they pass. The materials used in their construction include metals with unusual psychic dampening properties, chosen specifically for their relationship with warp energy. The hulls absorb rather than reflect. The ships absorb rather than shine. Even their electromagnetic signatures are minimal and strange, less present on instruments than vessels of their size should be. They are built to be practically invisible in every sense that matters, because visibility draws attention. And there are things in both the material universe and the immaterium that would love to know exactly where a ship full of thousands of Psykers is at any given moment. Each Imperial world receives a collection visit approximately once every 100 years. The standard operating procedure for a collection cycle is essentially a large-scale civic event, organized by the Planetary Governor's Office and the local Adeptus Administratum, coordinating with the Adeptus Arbites and whatever local enforcement is available. The holding facilities that house the already identified Psykers are prepared for transfer. Hunting teams deploy from the ship to scour the population for anyone who has not yet been officially registered. But the preliminary assessment apparatus is readied for the initial evaluations that will determine how each individual Psyker is categorized before the full assessment on Terra. The holding facilities themselves, called Sanctum Psykarnas, are purpose-built containment environments that have been in operation on most worlds for much longer than any living person can remember. They are not comfortable. They were never designed to be comfortable. The walls are inscribed with psychic warding, the floors and ceilings incorporating psychic dampening materials, the atmosphere maintained at conditions that minimize the likelihood of spontaneous psychic manifestation from the people held inside. The individuals confined in these facilities experience a specific and consistent form of sensory deprivation that has no analogue in ordinary imprisonment. The constant background hum of the warp, which a Psyker normally experiences as a kind of sixth sense, a low-level awareness of the psychic texture of the surrounding world, is cut off by the warding. The world goes flat, reduced to its purely physical components, the richness of information that the Psyker's sensitivity normally provides. the emotional states of nearby people, the faint tracery of the immaterial.
I want to pause here for a second because this topic genuinely gets to me every time I sit with it. There's something about the Psyker's situation specifically that hits differently from most of the other horrors in the setting. The Space Marines at least get a sword and a purpose. The Imperial Guard get a las gun and a speech about glory. The Psyker gets born wrong, gets hunted for it, and then gets processed by a machine that needed them alive but never really needed them. What I keep coming back to is the scale of it. 1,000 souls a day, every day for 10,000 years, and somewhere in that number is someone who had a family that loved them. Someone who maybe could have been a healer or an advisor, or just a person who made their small corner of the Imperium slightly less terrible. And instead, they went into the machine. That is the 40K universe at its most honest. Not the battles, not the monsters, just the machine running quietly underneath everything. Doing what it has to do to keep the lights on. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Interpenetrating every surface, the subtle warp echoes of events, past and future, that a sufficiently sensitive individual can sometimes detect, all of it silenced. What remains, in that silenced space, is the ordinary world, and the sounds of other people who are also imprisoned, and the weight of what is coming. The transfer from the holding facilities to the black ship's holds is handled with the brisk, though impersonal efficiency of an operation that has been performed identically for millennia. Psykers are processed in groups. Their personal histories, their power assessments, their psychological profiles are catalogued and filed. Their identities are reduced to case numbers in a system that tracks them through their entire journey, without much attention to the fact that the case number refers to a person who has a name and a history, and people who loved them once. They are shackled in restraints that are not merely mechanical, but incorporate psychic dampening elements, devices that further reduce the already suppressed connection to the warp that the warded environment maintains. They board under guard. And among the cargo, there are children. The Scholastica Psychana's preference for collecting young psychers is documented and consistent. Young minds are more plastic, more receptive to the training disciplines that safe psychic practice requires, more capable of internalizing the habits and frameworks that make it possible to use warp energy without being destroyed by it. The ideal candidate, from the institution's perspective, is a child whose powers are just beginning to manifest, who has not yet had years of uncontrolled use, building up bad habits and deepening unprotected connections. These very young psychers, children who may not even fully understand why they are being taken or where they are going, are loaded into the same holds as adults who have spent decades in hiding, years in the sanctum psychana, a lifetime under the weight of the secret they were born with. The youngest child in any given hold might be 6 years old, 7, 8, old enough to understand that something terrible is happening and that the people they love are not coming to stop it. Too young to understand why, too young to know what a black ship is or what terror means or what the assessment will determine about their future. Old enough to cry, old enough to be afraid, old enough to lie awake in the dark of the hold, listening to the sounds of other frightened people and wondering if this is something that anyone ever comes back from. There is a passage recorded in multiple historical and religious sources that captures this moment with a simplicity that elaborate description cannot improve on. It speaks of counting the souls bound for service, men, women and children, young and old, the sick and the sound. The voice of someone who can feel the chains on the others as if they are on their own limbs, and someone who knows where they are going and knows what it means. The plain recitation of the human diversity in that cargo hold, the range of ages and conditions and levels of understanding, is more devastating than anything more dramatically framed would be, because it asks you to sit with the reality of it, rather than giving you a frame to put around it. The hunting operations that accompany a black ship's arrival are worth understanding in detail, because they represent the most active and visible phase of the collection process, the moment when the Imperium's institutional reach extends most comprehensively into the lives of ordinary communities. When the black ship enters a system, It does not merely communicate with the planetary governor and wait for the levy to be delivered. It deploys agents. These agents are organized into specialized hunting teams, each equipped with instruments calibrated for psychic detection and staffed by individuals whose qualifications for the work include their own psychic sensitivity in some cases, and extensive training in the behavioral and circumstantial signs of concealed psychic ability in all cases. They move through cities and settlements and rural areas methodically, working through the population in sectors, checking records, following up on years-old reports that were never quite sufficient for formal action, investigating the places where unsanctioned psychers tend to congregate by necessity. The Psyhounds accompanying these teams are perhaps the most effective single tool in the hunting operation. And the presence of a Psyker with even moderate ability who is specifically trained to detect other Psykers makes the concealment strategies that work against purely technological detection significantly less effective. The warp presence of a hiding Psyker cannot be fully suppressed. It can be dimmed. It cannot be extinguished. And a Psyhound walking down a street can feel the difference between the background psychic noise of an ordinary population and the specific, brighter signature of someone who is not ordinary, even if that person is doing everything in their power to seem so. For the Psyker who has successfully hidden for years, for the person who has built something recognizable as a life in the margins of the Imperium, the arrival of the hunting teams represents the collapse of everything they have constructed. There is no negotiation. There is no character witness who can speak to their harmlessness. The detection instruments do not care about harmlessness. The Psyhound does not care about harmlessness. The collection authority that takes them into custody and begins the process of documentation and transfer is not interested in the particular history of this individual, the years of careful management, the relationships maintained, the harm deliberately and consistently not done. The machine does not distinguish between the genuinely dangerous Psyker who has barely kept their abilities contained and the gentle one who has never hurt anyone. Both of them have the mutation. Both of them go to the ship, and the ship leaves, and it does not come back. At Part 4, in the dark between worlds, life inside the holds. The interior architecture of a black ship is not like any other class of vessel in Imperial service, and the more time you spend understanding what these ships were built to do, the more every design choice they embody makes a specific and terrible kind of sense. These are not warships, though they have weapons and defenses commensurate with their importance. They are not luxury transports or commercial vessels, or the utilitarian craft of the Imperial Navy. They are, at their functional core, prisons that move. The engineering priorities that govern every aspect of their design are oriented around two things: keeping the occupants alive and keeping them contained. Comfort, where it exists at all, is incidental. The holds where the Psykers are housed during transit are vast and dark, lit by minimal artificial lighting that provides illumination without ambience, fitted with sleeping surfaces and sanitation facilities sufficient to prevent the kind of disease outbreak that would reduce the value of the cargo, maintained at temperatures and atmospheric conditions that keep people functional, not warm, not clean in any sense beyond clinical adequacy, functional. The psi shielding is present in everything. It is not possible to describe the interior of a black ship's hold without returning to this, because it is the defining quality of the environment. The materials used in the construction of these vessels were chosen, in many cases over millennia of refinement and experiment, for their psychic properties. And certain metals and composites have unusual relationships with warp energy, absorbing or disrupting it rather than transmitting it. The warding inscribed on every surface, layered over centuries of use until some of it has been renewed so many times that the original markings beneath are only accessible to instruments, performs active psychic suppression rather than mere passive resistance. The result is an environment that is not merely spiritually neutral, the way most of the material universe is spiritually neutral. It is spiritually active. It pushes back against the warp. It compresses the psychic signature of everyone inside it toward the baseline of an ordinary human, suppressing the bright signal fire of the Psyker towards something approaching the candle of the uninitiated. For the prisoners, and this suppression is a specific and consistent form of torture, though it is not recognized as such by the institutional framework that operates the ships. A Psyker's relationship to their warp connection is not analogous to the relationship between a sighted person and their eyesight. The connection is more fundamental than that. It is not one sense among several, one channel of information among many. It is the sense that contextualizes all the others, the framework through which the Psyker experiences the world, as inhabited by minds and emotions, and the subtle presence of a dimension that underlies everything. When that sense is suppressed, the world does not merely seem quieter, it seems wrong, incomplete, flattened. The richness of information that the Psyker's sensitivity normally provides, involuntarily and continuously, simply stops, and what remains feels like trying to understand a conversation, while only being able to read the speaker's lips, a reduced and less reliable version of what perception is supposed to be. Multiply this individual experience by the thousands of people sharing the hold, each of whom is experiencing their own version of the same deprivation. The collective psychic output of this many distressed, suppressed, frightened individuals, even dampened by the warding, creates what multiple sources describe as a persistent atmosphere of soul-numbing despair that permeates the entire ship. Not just the holds, the crew spaces, the command decks, the maintenance corridors, everywhere. The suppressed psychic misery of the cargo bleeds through the warding in diminished but not eliminated form, it coloring the emotional environment of every person on the vessel. Only those with exceptional psychological resilience and specific mental training can tolerate duty aboard a black ship for extended periods. And even they, the records suggest, are marked by it. There is a quality of quietness in long-service black ship crew that people who meet them in other contexts often describe as eerie. A stillness, a difficulty connecting to ordinary emotional registers. The journey to terror is long. This needs to be held clearly in mind. A black ship does not complete its collection circuit and proceed directly to terror. It continues to every world on its route, filling the holds incrementally, world by world, over a circuit that might take a year or more to complete. The Psyker loaded aboard at the first stop on the circuit may spend many months in the hold before the ship finally turns for terror, and then the transit to terror itself, depending on conditions in the warp and the specific route available to the ship's navigator, adds additional weeks or months. During all of that time, the prisoners exist. They develop what communities they can. The dynamics of the hold, with its mixture of ages and backgrounds and levels of psychic ability and psychological stability, produce a social environment that is strange and intense in ways that have no real analogue outside this specific context. Psykers who are still discovering what they are exist alongside people who have spent decades managing their abilities. Children exist alongside adults who have lived lives of great complexity and pain. That people from different worlds, with different languages and different cultural frameworks and different levels of basic education, are compressed together in shared captivity. The word sibling, the term that psychers use for each other that is drawn specifically from this shared experience, has its roots in this context. In the holds of the black ships, the ordinary social categories that normally organize human interaction, class, profession, world of origin, all become secondary to the single shared fact of what everyone in the hold is and where they are going. The bond that forms from shared catastrophe, from the particular intimacy of suffering together in the dark, has its own distinct quality. The people who share a black ship voyage are not friends in the ordinary sense. They are witnesses to each other. And witnessing is sometimes deeper than friendship. The warp transit itself, when it comes, is a separate and additional ordeal. For ordinary humans, warp travel is disturbing in a fairly consistent way. The material separating real space from the immaterium becomes permeable during transit. Dreams intensify and take on a reality-adjacent quality. The sense of being observed by something that cannot be specified becomes persistent and difficult to ignore. The rules of ordinary physics seem to soften at their edges. For Psykers, even suppressed ones, the experience is amplified by the nature of their connection to the warp. The dimension they are traveling through is the dimension their consciousness is fundamentally rooted in. During transit, even through the layers of protective warding, yet the connection that has been compressed and suppressed reasserts itself in partial and unreliable ways. Flashes of psychic awareness, sounds that have no physical source, the emotional states of distant entities in the warp, enormous and alien and incomprehensible, pressing dimly against the edge of perception. The entities that inhabit the Imperium are always at least dimly aware of this many Psykers moving through their domain, even contained as they are. They cannot get through the warding, but they can press against it with the patient attention of things that have nothing but time. The Psykers in the hold feel this pressure. They experience it as intrusive thoughts, as disturbing imagery that appears without being invited, as the sense of something enormous and close and intensely interested in them personally. As some of them develop the specific kind of psychological dissociation that comes from sustained exposure to incomprehensible stimuli, a defensive retreat from full awareness that the mind uses as a last measure of self-protection when full engagement with the environment becomes unsupportable. The ship emerges from the warp and the pressure eases, but the people inside it are not quite the same people who boarded. Some of them are quieter now than they were before. Some of them have a specific quality of inwardness that was not there at the beginning of the voyage. Some of them have lost contact with dimensions of their own experience that they may or may not recover. This is the state in which the cargo of Psykers arrives at Terra. Part 5. The Hollow Warriors. Understanding the Sisters of Silence. Before the assessment and the final judgment, before the moment when each Psyker's future is decided, it is worth dwelling on the specific and remarkable beings who make the entire transport operation logistically possible, the Sisters of Silence. Understanding the Sisters requires understanding something about the structure of the setting's metaphysics that is sometimes underemphasized. The warp, as discussed, is a dimension of psychic energy that underlies reality and that is generated by and responsive to the minds of all living things. Psykers have strong presences in it. Ordinary humans have moderate presences in it. Every conscious being with a soul casts a shadow in the Imperium. There are exceptions. As the Sisters of Silence are drawn from individuals who carry what is called the pariah gene, an extremely rare mutation that makes its bearer not merely psychically inert, the way an ordinary human might be described as psychically inert, but actively, aggressively absent from the warp. Where a Psyker burns like a signal fire, where an ordinary human burns like a candle, a pariah does not burn at all. Not a blown-out candle, not an ember, literally nothing. The space where their presence in the warp should be is simply empty. The Imperium, from the perspective of anything that perceives through it, cannot detect them at all. This absence is not passive, it is active. A pariah does not merely fail to generate psychic presence. They generate the inverse of psychic presence. What their existence in physical space creates a field of psychic negation around them, a radius of active suppression that affects everything within it. Psychic abilities used in the vicinity of a pariah are weakened or nullified. Demonic entities that could otherwise operate in physical space are suppressed or driven back. The warp itself is compressed and thinned in their vicinity, as if their existence somehow locally reduces the permeability of the membrane between dimensions. For Psykers, this field is directly and physically painful. The abrupt suppression of the warp connection that defines their perception of reality is not merely disorienting when it comes from the environment of the black ship's warding. When it comes from a living pariah in proximity, it is experienced as an active assault on something fundamental to the self. The closest analogy available is perhaps the sensation of having a part of your body that you did not know you used suddenly and completely fail. Except the part that fails is not physical, but is instead the primary mode through which you experience being alive. For ordinary humans, the pariah's presence produces instinctive unease, an irrational, persistent wish to be somewhere else. The feeling that something in the immediate vicinity is deeply wrong, without being able to articulate what that wrong thing is. This reaction is hardwired, not learned. It does not diminish with familiarity. People who know and like a specific pariah as a person can intellectually override this instinctive response in the moment, but the instinct itself never goes away. It is the biological equivalent of every alarm system in the human nervous system going off simultaneously for a cause that cannot be rationally identified. The Sisters of Silence are an organization composed entirely of individuals with this trait. Founded in the early years of the Emperor's Imperium, operating from the Somnus Citadel on Luna, they served as the militant arm of the institution that became the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the Witch Hunters, and the Guardians of the Black Ships, the living weapons against psychic threats. Their historical record in the setting's pre-Horus heresy era is extraordinary. They participated in critical campaigns against psychic enemies during the Great Crusade. They played a fundamental role in the defense of Terra during the siege that ended the heresy. They are, just in the capacity in which they were designed, perhaps the most effective anti-Psyker force that has ever existed. The price of being what they are is a specific and permanent social exile. The pariah's aura never diminishes. It never becomes safe for ordinary humans to be around. The most profound intimacy possible between a Sister of Silence and another person is a relationship in which the other person has learned to consciously and consistently override the instinctive recoil that the Sister's presence generates. Not neutralize it. Override it. The recoil is always there. The other person simply chooses, moment to moment, to act against it. This is the best available option. It is not a comfortable foundation for human connection. The Sisters take a vow of silence upon full induction. The practical reasons for this. In an organization that operates in psychically hostile environments, where verbal communication creates vulnerabilities, are real, but the symbolic dimension is also present. The Sisters are defined by their absence. Their silence, in a literal sense, is the most honest expression of who they are. Beings who live in a world that instinctively, continuously repels them, who serve a humanity that cannot fully tolerate their presence, who protect the very people who flinch away from them. On the Black Ships, the Sisters serve as both deterrents and operational management tools. Their presence in the holds creates immediate and total suppression of any psychic activity in the vicinity, more complete than the environmental warding alone can achieve. A Sister walking through the hold is a mobile field of psychic nullification, and every Psyker in their path experiences the sudden deepening of suppression as a distinct and unpleasant event. Their ability to contain genuinely dangerous Psykers, individuals whose power is sufficient to potentially breach the warding through sheer intensity, is the essential backstop of the entire transport system. In the 41st Millennium's main timeline, the Sisters exist in reduced numbers and reduced institutional standing compared to their historical peak. The complicated political history of the Imperium after the heresy, including active opposition from the ecclesiarchy at various points, has reduced their organization from a galaxy-spanning force to something smaller and more scattered. They remain essential to the Black Ships. They remain, as the setting moves forward in time, as being gradually restored to something closer to their former prominence. But for most of the Psykers riding in the holds, the Sisters they encounter are rare enough to be shocking when they do appear, the suppression so total and so sudden that even prepared individuals often react with audible distress. Part 6. Judgment at the Threshold. Terra and the Assessment. Terra, the throne world of the Imperium of Man, is a world that no longer quite qualifies as a world in the ordinary sense. It has been inhabited by humans for longer than almost any other planet in the setting's timeline. It has been at the center of human civilization's most significant upheavals, wars, and transformations. It has been the seat of the most powerful government in human history for 10,000 years of continuous operation. And it shows all of this in the most literal possible way. The original surface of the planet is buried under approximately 60 kilometers of accumulated construction. Architecture stacked on architecture, stacked on architecture, each layer built on the ruins or the foundations of what came before, going down so deep that the lowest inhabited levels have not seen sunlight in thousands of years, going up so high that the greatest spires of the Imperial Palace pierce weather systems that the billions living in the lower levels will never directly experience. The air is processed and recycled. The food comes from hydroponic facilities so deep in the structure that the concept of natural growth has become abstract. The human population, enormous and layered and differentiated by depth as much as geography, lives in a city that is also a monument to 10,000 years of continuous power, which is also, at its heart, a life support system for a single man who has been dying for 10 millennia and cannot be allowed to complete the process. This is where the black ships bring their cargo. The experience of approaching terror for a Psyker in the holds of a black ship is distinct from the approach experience for anyone else on the vessel. The Golden Throne, deep beneath the surface of the planet in the bowels of the Imperial Palace, emits a psychic signature that can be detected by sensitive individuals from a considerable distance, even through the suppressing environment of the ship, not as something clear or comprehensible, more as a presence. A weight in the warp that speaks of something immeasurably old and powerful, and not fully within the ordinary categories of conscious experience. For Psykers who have spent months in the complete psychic silence of the holds, this first touch of terror's psychic resonance is startling in the way that a sudden loud sound is startling in a silent room. It is not necessarily frightening, but it is overwhelming, and it carries the particular quality of something that cannot quite be processed by the mental architecture that ordinary human consciousness provides. The disembarkation and processing at Terra is efficiently organized. The Psykers move from ship to holding to assessment facility through corridors that have performed this function for so long that the human traffic of 10,000 years has worn them smooth. They are documented, assigned identifiers within the administrative system, sorted by preliminary assessment grades. The adepts who process them work with the practiced efficiency of people performing a task so routine that it has become mechanical, which is both understandable and, from the perspective of the person being processed, deeply alienating. The officials of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica do not usually look at the person. They look at the file, they look at the preliminary assessment numbers, they make notations, they move to the next one. The assessment itself is the formal evaluation that determines everything. The scale used, called the assignment, is a 24-point system based on the ancient Greek alphabet. An Alpha Plus, at the maximum power end, represents individuals whose psychic ability is so vast as to make even institutional deployment genuinely dangerous. Individuals the setting repeatedly describes as being too powerful to be reliably managed, even by the Imperium's most experienced handlers. These are the rarest cases, and they are handled with extreme caution when they are found. Below Alpha Plus, in decreasing order of raw power, the scale descends through Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and so on down to Omega, which represents the minimum threshold of psychic ability, and then into the negative numbers, where the pariah gene begins to express itself in various grades of psychic nullity. The assessment does not measure only raw power. Power without control is one of the most dangerous possible combinations in the setting. The evaluation also measures psychological stability, which in this context means the robustness of the Psyker's mental architecture in the face of warp contact, the strength of their will to maintain identity coherence under the kind of pressure that demonic entities bring to bear on a mind they are trying to invade. It measures the presence and degree of any existing corruption or taint. Evidence that unprotected contact with the warp has already allowed some degree of immaterial influence into the Psyker's consciousness. It measures the specific nature and expression of the Psyker's abilities, because some disciplines are more readily trained and institutionally useful than others. The instruments used in the assessment actively engage the Psyker's warp connection in controlled ways, forcing brief and measured encounters with the Imperium to produce readings. For the Psyker who has spent months in psychic suppression, this active engagement is intensely disorienting. The part of their perception that has been compressed and silenced is suddenly being probed and stimulated, forced into a kind of partial operation in a context where the full environment of the assessment chamber is still working to prevent uncontrolled manifestation. It is not a comfortable experience. For individuals whose psychological stability has been compromised by the journey, by prior exposure to possession or taint, by the accumulated weight of years of uncontrolled use, this forced engagement can trigger episodes that require immediate physical intervention. The results of the assessment determine everything. Yet the majority of the Psykers who arrive from the Black Ships do not pass the assessment at a level that qualifies them for training and service. This is not because the standards are arbitrary. The standards exist for reasons that the Imperium has documented in blood across 10,000 years of trying to manage psychic ability in the human population. A Psyker who is too weak-willed to reliably maintain mental coherence under warp pressure, who is already too compromised by prior taint, who does not have the specific combination of power and control that makes safe institutional use possible, is not someone the Scholastica Psychana can train into a functional, sanctioned Psyker. The training would fail. The Psyker would deteriorate. The consequences of that deterioration, what in someone who has been given institutional access to warp energy through the training process, are worse than the consequences of not training them. So the ones who do not pass are redirected. They will serve the Emperor in a different way, a way that requires no training, because training implies a future, and what these individuals are redirected toward does not have one. Part 7. The price of the light. Fuel for the Astronomicon. Among the many things in the 40,000 setting that are difficult to fully absorb, the daily operation of the Astronomicon is perhaps the one that requires the most sustained effort to hold clearly in mind, because the scale of it resists comprehension in a way that even the setting's most dramatic battles do not. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon, the most powerful artificial psychic signal in the galaxy, maintained from Terra by a complex of ancient and only partially understood machinery, directed by the still active mind of the Emperor of Mankind, and used by the navigators of the Imperium's warships and transport vessels to find their way through the warp. Without it, the warp's fundamental lack of stable geography makes interstellar travel across the distances the Imperium spans effectively impossible. Without interstellar travel at scale, the Imperium ceases to function as a coherent entity. Without a functioning Imperium, humanity in the 41st millennium faces annihilation from multiple simultaneous directions. The Astronomicon is not optional. It is the keystone without which the entire structure of human civilization in the setting collapses, and it is maintained, day by day, by the death of human beings. Then the number that appears across multiple canonical sources is approximately 1,000 Psykers consumed every single day to maintain the beacon's operation. Some sources place the figure higher, and at least one historical record indicates that during periods of particular instability, particularly as the Eye of Terror expanded in the 36th millennium, the consumption rate increased to approximately 4 times the baseline, 1,000 souls per day, 10,000 years of days. The arithmetic of this is, by any ordinary moral framework, staggering. The total number of individual human beings consumed by this single institutional process over the post-heresy period of the setting is in the billions, and the number keeps increasing. The specific mechanism by which this consumption happens is deliberately obscured in the canonical sources, or which is probably the right narrative choice, because whatever the actual physical reality of the process, leaving it underspecified allows the imagination to work. And what the imagination produces when confronted with the phrase, 1,000 souls consumed every day to maintain a lighthouse that keeps the ships from being lost is, in most cases, sufficient. What can be said is this: the Psykers designated for this purpose are connected, in some way, to the machinery of the Golden Throne. Their psychic energy, the bright presence in the warp that defined their existence since the moment their mutation activated, is drawn out of them through this connection. Not tapped and partially used and replenished, drawn out entirely. The process is described as fatal, which in this context means not merely that the physical body stops functioning, but that the psychic component, the soul, the warp presence that the human being has been maintaining since birth, is exhausted, gone. The person stops being a presence in the Imperium. The fire is extinguished. What remains, if anything, is not described in terms that suggest continued consciousness. The people who entered the consumption process are simply no longer there, in any dimension of existence that the setting's metaphysics recognizes. For the Psykers redirected to this purpose after the assessment, there is typically a period of preparation. This preparation is partly logistical and partly in a way that says something important about how the Imperium manages the emotional demands of what it does, philosophical. The individuals are given time and instruction, and in some cases genuine care, before the process begins. They are explained, as clearly as possible, what their death will accomplish. The ships that travel through the warp safely, guided by a light that only Psykers can see, the billions of lives that depend on the navigation the Astronomicon provides, the worlds that would be lost without it, these are presented to the people who are about to die for them. Whether this context makes it better or worse depends entirely on the individual. There are people for whom meaning is sufficient, for whom the knowledge that their death will accomplish something real and essential is enough to face it with something like peace. There are also people for whom no amount of meaning reframes being killed for institutional purposes into something acceptable, and for whom the explanation simply adds the indignity of propaganda to the indignity of compulsion. The Adeptus Astronomica, the organization that manages the ongoing operation of the Astronomicon, maintains its own population of Psykers specifically trained for this purpose from childhood. These are the chosen, individuals who have been members of the organization since they were young, who have grown up in its philosophical and spiritual framework, who have been educated in the meaning and importance of their eventual role, and who approach it, by all available accounts, with genuine conviction. For these specific individuals, the sacrifice is chosen in a meaningful sense. To whatever degree any choice made within so total an institutional framework can be called genuinely free. Or they are different from the Psykers who arrive from the black ships and are redirected here after failing the assessment. The redirected ones did not grow up in this framework. They did not choose. They are simply people whose psychic ability was not quite sufficient for training, but was still sufficient to be useful in this other way, and so the machine has found a use for them. Both populations are processed through the same machinery. Both are consumed by it. The distinction in their relationship to the process is real, and it matters in some moral sense, but the final result is identical. The beacon burns. The ships navigate. The Imperium endures. Part 8. What is taken and what remains. Soulbinding and the survivors. Now the story changes shape. But because not everyone who passes through the assessment is redirected to the Astronomicon, the ones who survive, the ones who demonstrate both the psychic strength and the psychological coherence that the assessment measures, the ones whose power and will are in sufficient proportion to each other to make training viable and service possible. These individuals are designated for a different path, and their path, while it offers life rather than the alternative, involves its own specific and permanent costs. The largest category of survivors becomes astropaths, and to become an astropath, a Psyker must undergo the soul-binding ritual, which is one of the most singular experiences available to a human being in the setting and which comes with permanent physical consequences that cannot be avoided and cannot be reversed. And to understand why the ritual exists, the function it serves must be understood clearly. The ability that makes an astropath, the capacity to send and receive telepathic messages across interstellar distances through the warp, requires a level of controlled engagement with the Imperium that far exceeds what most Psykers can safely achieve with natural ability and training alone. An astropath, when transmitting a message, is extending their consciousness into the warp and projecting a psychic signal strong enough to be received by another astropath, potentially hundreds of light years away. They are doing this in an environment populated by entities that find psychic minds intensely interesting. They are doing it without physical distance from those entities as a protection, much because the warp has no geography in the ordinary sense. They are doing it repeatedly, professionally, for years or decades. Without protection, beyond natural ability, an astropath attempting to transmit would be like a person trying to maintain a phone call in the middle of a crowded station, where every other person in the station is trying simultaneously to possess them. The signal would be lost. The astropath would be lost. The protection that makes this survivable comes from the soul-binding ritual, which provides a specific and permanent form of armoring to the Psyker's mind and soul that derives from the Emperor's own psychic power. The preparation for the ritual takes time. Months of fasting and meditation and increasingly intense psychic exercises designed to build the specific mental architecture that the transfer requires. That the astropaths who will undergo the ritual are given the best preparation that the Scholastica Psychana knows how to provide. They are as ready as any human being can be made to be for what is coming. Then, in groups of approximately 100, they are brought in procession to the Emperor. What this means in the 41st millennium is different from what it meant in the early days of the Imperium, before the Golden Throne was necessary. The Emperor does not speak. The Emperor does not move. The Emperor does not acknowledge the processions of frightened young Psykers who kneel before his throne in the deep chambers beneath the Imperial Palace. What remains of the Emperor's consciousness is present in the warp in ways that are not well described in accessible terms, and it is that warp presence, that vast and ancient and only partially comprehensible psychic intelligence, that is the source of the soul binding. The ritual is not simply exposure, it is contact. The Emperor's psychic presence reaches into each kneeling Psyker's mind and does something to it. Something that reshapes the neural architecture. Something that installs a kind of internal bracing, a structural reinforcement that allows the mind to hold and direct psychic power without being destroyed by it, and that provides the specific anchor against warp predation that astropathic work requires. The reshaping also opens the mind to the full range of astropathic capability, allowing the astropath to use the warp as a communication medium in ways that were previously impossible. The cost of this reshaping is the sensory nerves, the intensity of the contact, the sheer psychic magnitude of what is passing through the Psyker's mind and body during the ritual overloads the sensory processing systems. The optical nerves are the most consistently affected. The light that passes through the eyes during the ritual, which is not physical light but the psychic analog of it, the radiance of the Emperor's presence in the warp, is so intense that the biological tissues responsible for mediating visual perception cannot survive it intact. Almost universally, astropaths emerge from the soul-binding blind, not partially sighted, not able to distinguish light from dark, functionally, organically, permanently blind. Their eyes may appear sunken or scarred around the sockets, or simply vacant, the structures that once served them burned out from within. Some lose additional senses. The damage to the nervous system can extend beyond the optical nerves depending on the specifics of the individual's neurological configuration and the particulars of how the ritual interacted with it. Hearing, in some cases, smell, touch. The full sensory picture of an individual astropath's impairment is specific to them. But the loss of sight is the baseline, the thing that is so consistent that a sighted astropath is an exception worth commenting on in the sources. Not all of them survive the ritual itself. Despite the months of preparation, despite the careful selection of candidates who have demonstrated stability and sufficient power, the contact with the Emperor's psychic essence remains genuinely dangerous. It is contact with something that a human mind was not designed, by any evolutionary or developmental logic, to withstand. For some of the Psykers kneeling in the ritual chamber simply die there. Their minds encounter what they encounter and cannot absorb it without shattering. Others survive the ritual but do not survive intact, their psychological coherence compromised in ways that are not visible from outside, but that become apparent over time, a slow deterioration that will need to be managed for whatever life remains. The survivors who emerge with both their purpose and their sanity, blinded but functional, begin the last phase of their preparation before deployment. They learn to navigate the world through their psychic senses. They learn the specific disciplines of astropathic communication. They are trained in the encoding of messages through symbolic and metaphorical language that survives the distortions of warp transit better than literal content does. They learn to interpret the garbled, fragmentary, sometimes corrupted messages they receive in return. They learn the signals that indicate a message is being interfered with, the specific quality of demonic interference that can inject false content into a transmission. They learn, in short, how to do a job that is never safe and is always necessary, and that most of the people who receive the messages they carry will never think about at all. Then they are deployed. The Imperium needs astropaths everywhere. A planet without one is a planet that cannot communicate with the rest of the Imperium in any timely fashion, cannot receive orders or intelligence or support in any form that can cross the distances of interstellar space at practical speed. The demand for astropaths is effectively insatiable. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica distributes them with the comprehensive impersonality of a bureaucracy allocating essential resources, because that is exactly what they are, essential resources. The individual astropath's preference as to where they serve is not among the criteria used to determine their posting. For the sanctioned Psykers who are not designated as astropaths, but for other roles, the training is different and the work is different. But the fundamental character of the life is similar. The small number of Psykers strong enough and controlled enough to serve as battlefield Psykers in the Astra Militarum receive training in the weaponized deployment of their abilities, are learning to call down psychic lightning and project kinetic force, and read the movements of enemy Psykers and sustain protective fields around the soldiers they serve alongside. Every time they use these abilities in combat, they do so knowing that each draw on the warp is a risk, that the attention they attract from the immaterium during combat use is not reliably manageable, that the commissar standing beside them will execute them the moment their control shows signs of failing if it comes to that. And they know that this threat is not empty. The commissar will do it. They have always done it. This is part of what a commissar is. Part 9. The life that follows. Existing after sanctioning. Surviving the entire process, the capture and the voyage, and the assessment and the ritual and the training, as arriving at the point where you are alive and functional and designated for service. This is the best possible outcome of being born a Psyker in the 41st millennium. Let us sit with what that best possible outcome looks like in daily practice. The astropath, who has been deployed to a posting, perhaps a ship in the Imperial Navy that relies on them for communication with Fleet Command, perhaps a planetary relay station on a world at the edge of the Administratum's reliable reach, perhaps a position within an Inquisitor's retinue where their abilities will be directed toward whatever specific work the Inquisitor pursues. This person wakes every morning in a physical body that cannot see. They navigate their environment through psychic senses that are more reliable and in some ways richer than visual perception, but that also expose them continuously to the emotional and psychic states of everyone around them. They cannot turn off their sensitivity to the minds nearby. Every strong emotion within their range registers. Every psychic disturbance in the vicinity is felt as a physical sensation in their expanded senses. The relationship between an astropath and the people they work alongside is inevitably a complicated one. The astropath knows things about those people that the people have not shared, because the passive broadcast of emotion and surface thought that any psychic sensitivity picks up cannot be consented to or controlled by the people broadcasting it. An astropath who serves on a Navy vessel for years knows, in the particular intimacy of involuntary psychic perception, the emotional lives of the officers and crew to an extent that none of them would willingly permit if they understood what they were sharing. The astropath learns to carry this knowledge carefully, to act as if they do not know what they know, to maintain the social fiction of normal informational privacy while existing in a state of permanent and unavoidable violation of it. Some astropaths develop a specific ethical framework around this, a set of internal rules for how to handle the information their sensitivity generates. Others simply learn to not register most of what they receive, to treat the constant background radiation of other people's internal states as environmental noise rather than personal content, the way someone who lives near a busy road learns to not hear the traffic. This selective inattention is a skill, not a natural state. It requires practice. It can fail under stress. They transmit messages. Some of these messages are routine administrative communications, the ordinary logistics of a civilization spanning a million worlds. Some of them are desperate warnings of incoming threats. Some of them are the last communications from worlds on the verge of falling, the final broadcast before silence. The astropath who serves in the Imperial Navy may spend decades as a relay point for the constant flow of military intelligence and operational orders that keep fleets coordinated across the enormous distances of stellar space. They hear the urgency in every message they carry. They feel the weight of the information because they are not merely transmitting content, they are transmitting psychic imprints, emotional residues that accompany every thought that passes through the warp. They know, on some level that is below articulation but above ignorance, what the messages they carry mean and what will happen or has already happened in consequence of them. The messages they receive are not always whole and clean. Warp transmission is a medium with inherent noise, and the noise is not random static, but the deliberate interference of entities that would prefer the message not arrive. A distorted message can be partially decoded through experience and skill. It can be interpreted through the context of other messages received from the same source. It can be flagged as uncertain, the uncertainty noted in the formal record. But there are messages that arrive as fragments, meaning lost or changed in transit. That the astropath must make a judgment call about, that the mission or the survival of people at the other end may depend on, and that the astropath cannot be certain about, because the warp is what it is. Carrying the consequences of those judgment calls, the times the interpretation was right and the times it was wrong, is another accumulation that sits in the sediment of a long career. Many astropaths become, over the course of long service, psychologically worn in a specific and consistent way. Not mad, not obviously damaged, just worn. The accumulation of witnessed urgency, of carried crisis, of messages that represented the last hope of people they have never met and will never meet, leaves a specific kind of residue in the psyche. They tend, in personal interactions outside of work, toward the same oblique, metaphor-heavy communication style they use in their professional transmissions, the encoding and decoding becoming a mode of expression rather than merely a professional technique. They are often described by people who know them as somehow distant, as if a portion of their attention is always elsewhere, which in some functional sense it is. Due to the draining nature of the soulbinding and the sustained psychic effort required by active transmission work, many astropaths age faster than their bodies would otherwise require. The biological life expectancy of a human being in the 41st millennium is already variable and often shortened by the material conditions of the Imperium. But among astropaths, even accounting for this, a certain acceleration of physical decline is documented. The psychic effort is a real physiological cost. What the body pays for what the mind does in the warp. An astropath who has been in active service for 40 years often presents physically as someone older than their chronological age. The cellular toll of sustained warp engagement, visible in ways that cannot be entirely attributed to normal aging. The sanctioned Psykers serving in military roles, the Primaris Psykers, alongside the Astra Militarum regiments, face a different version of the same fundamental problem. They are always the person in the unit who is most at risk and whose risk is most threatening to everyone else. Not merely at risk of being killed in combat, which is a risk shared equally by all soldiers. At risk of being the reason a combat deployment fails catastrophically, and at risk of being the person through whom the worst possible thing in the setting enters the material world. Every time they reach for the warp in the field, they do it knowing that this could be the time it goes wrong. They do it because the alternative, not reaching, not using what they have when the situation demands it, may mean death for the people they are serving alongside. They make this calculation, in varying forms, in every engagement. The Commissar, who accompanies every Astra Militarum unit, is a figure of authority and enforcement in multiple respects, but their specific relationship to the unit's Psyker carries a particular charge. The Commissar's mandate, among many things, includes the immediate execution of anyone who becomes a threat to unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. A Psyker losing control is the most rapidly escalating version of that threat the Commissar will ever face. Not because the Psyker has become an enemy, but because the Psyker has become a gateway. The soldier the Commissar shoots for cowardice or insubordination is a problem that ends with that soldier. The Psyker whose control fails in the wrong moment is a problem that can end with the entire unit and everyone in a radius, and possibly with a demonic incursion that requires an entirely different order of response. The Psyker knows the Commissar is there. The Psyker knows the Commissar knows why they are there. This awareness exists as a constant background pressure in the working relationship, never fully absent, shaping every interaction between them. Some Commissars develop genuine respect, even something approaching affection. For the Psykers they work alongside, the courage required to do the job being undeniable, and the competence of good Psykers being obviously real. Some Commissars treat the Psyker primarily as a managed threat, a useful tool that must never be allowed to forget that it is a tool. The Psyker navigates this depending on which kind of Commissar they have, and does not get to choose. The Inquisitors who employ Psykers in their retinues are working in the most warp-adjacent environments in the setting, investigating exactly the kinds of demonic activity and psychic corruption that Psykers are simultaneously best equipped to confront and most vulnerable to. An inquisitorial Psyker who has spent years in close contact with the work of the Ordo Malleus, investigating demonic incursions and chaos cults and the aftermath of possession events. Man is a person who has been in the sustained vicinity of things that are actively trying to find a way into human minds. They have done this work with the professional competence required by their role, and they have done it while being one of the most accessible potential targets in the immediate vicinity. The accumulated psychological weight of this, over a career, is substantial. The best Inquisitors understand this and manage their Psyker retinue accordingly. The worst do not think about it at all. There is a phrase that appears in the records, used by sanctioned Psykers among themselves, that speaks to the particular quality of the life they share. Sibling, not a term for friends or colleagues or allies. Sibling, the recognition of a specific kinship that has no other adequate vocabulary, more rooted in the shared experience of the black ships and the assessment and the choice, if it can be called a choice, that was made for them about what their life would be. The person you call sibling is the person who knows what the holds smell like, who knows the particular quality of the darkness during warp transit in a suppressed hold, who knows what the assessment felt like from the inside, who carries the same permanent brand that marks them as what they are to anyone who looks closely enough to see it. The same obligations, the same risks, the same complicated relationship with an institution that needs them and fears them and will eliminate them without hesitation if they become dangerous and cannot reliably distinguish that moment from the moment just before it. Sibling, in this usage, means I know, you know. No further explanation required. The brand itself is worth noting. Sanctioned Psykers in Imperial service bear physical marks that identify them as authorized. A brand, typically inscribed on the forehead, that carries a specific and verifiable minting that distinguishes it from any attempt at counterfeiting. The brand serves as both identification and warning, a declaration to anyone who sees it of what this person is, and that they are permitted to operate within the Imperium's framework. It is visible, it is permanent. It cannot be hidden without significant effort, and hiding it without proper authorization is itself a criminal act. The sanctioned Psyker moves through the world in a body that announces what it is, and the announcement produces, in the people who see it, a range of responses from respect to fear to unconcealed hostility that the Psyker must navigate as part of the basic texture of daily existence. A disgruntled Psyker described their own existence with a weariness that lands like a stone, a lifetime spent in the mire, hiding from the witch-seekers and the bigots in the most desolate places the Imperium of man has to offer, forced to sell extraordinary abilities to smugglers, gangers, and bounty hunters simply to survive. Not slain out of hand, not dissected, not drafted, not dragged aboard unmarked vessels, never to be seen again, but barely, always barely. The sanctioned Psyker has slightly better odds, but the fundamental tension between their usefulness and the fear that their existence generates in ordinary people never resolves. It simply becomes familiar, a texture they navigate rather than a problem they solve. Part 10. The machine that does not stop. The full scope of the horror. Step back now. Step all the way out of the individual's story and look at the system. We have followed one possible path through this machinery, from the first stirring of power to the final destination of whatever role the assessment designated. But this path is not one story. It is one instance of a story that happens millions of times every year, simultaneously, across every inhabited world in the Imperium. The machinery does not pause between cycles. There is always a black ship somewhere on its circuit, always a holding facility full of waiting psychers, always an assessment in progress, always a group of frightened human beings being processed toward one of a small number of outcomes, and none of which they chose. The Black Ship Fleet is the second largest fleet in the galaxy. This is not a poetic exaggeration or a rhetorical flourish. It is a factual description of the scale of infrastructure devoted entirely to the collection and transport of psychically gifted human beings for institutional processing. The fleet operates continuously. There is no off-season. There is no holiday. The circuits continue through wars and famines, and the opening of demonic rifts, and every other catastrophe that the setting produces, because the machine cannot stop. If it stops, the beacon dims. If the beacon dims, the ships are lost. If the ships are lost, the Imperium dissolves. And the Imperium dissolving, in the current state of the galaxy, means the end of organized human civilization. The numbers resist easy absorption, and millions of Psykers collected each year across all the worlds of the Imperium, tens of thousands of them arriving at Terra every single day, shuffled through the assessment apparatus, sorted into those who will serve and those who will be consumed. 1,000 of the latter consumed daily to maintain the Astronomicon, every day, for 10,000 years. The Scholastica Psychana, training its graduates, deploying them, watching them wear down under the specific pressures of their service, watching some of them fail, adding those failures to the casualty rolls. New recruits cycling through constantly to replace the ones who are gone. An institution as old as the Imperium itself, as essential to its function as any other, running without pause and without acknowledgement from most of the people who depend on it. What the Imperium does not do, or cannot do, is publicly acknowledge the full scope of what the machine requires. The official framing, the one that the ecclesiarchy and the planetary governors and the administratum bureaucrats maintain, is about honor and service and the emperor's blessing. The Psyker taken by the black ships is not a victim of a system that requires their death or their servitude. They are an honored servant, called to a sacred function, elevated by the tithe to a role of cosmic significance. The families who lose their children to the levy are encouraged to take pride in the elevation. The communities that have their psychically gifted members removed should understand this as a form of contribution to the collective survival of humanity. This framing is not entirely dishonest. The Astronomicon does sustain the Imperium. The astropaths do hold the communication network together. The sacrifices made by the Psykers who pass through the machine are, in the most literal and immediate sense, what allows the civilization to function. The meaning attributed to those sacrifices by the institutional framing is not fabricated. It is just incomplete. It omits the part where the people making the sacrifices did not choose them. It omits the part where the specific individuals who become the sacrifice were given no alternative and no voice in the decision. It omits the part where the personal experience of being processed through this system is not uplifting or sacred or honorable. It is, for most of the people experiencing it, terrifying and bewildering, and characterized by a complete absence of anyone in authority treating them as anything other than a resource. The communities that give up their psychers absorb losses that the official framing does not address. There is the personal grief, which the ecclesiarchy has extensive liturgy for managing. There is the social loss, the absence of an individual from the network of relationships and responsibilities that defined their position in the community, which is managed by the ordinary process of communal adaptation over time. And then there is the loss that no liturgy addresses, the specific intellectual and creative and social gifts that psychically sensitive individuals tend to bring to their communities, the unusual perceptiveness and the sometimes uncanny insight, and the specific kind of empathy that comes from genuinely feeling rather than merely inferring the emotional states of the people around you. These qualities leave with the Psyker, where the community is smaller without them in ways that cannot be precisely measured. The great rifts opening in the setting's recent history has created what might be described as a systemic crisis in the already strained collection apparatus. The rate at which new Psykers are being born across humanity has increased dramatically, driven by the massive influx of warp energy into real space through the cicatrix maledictum. The rate at which the black ships can collect and transport those Psykers has not increased equivalently, because the disruption to warp travel created by the rift itself makes the ship's circuits longer and more dangerous. On worlds that have been effectively cut off from regular tithe collection by the rift's disruption of navigation, the unsanctioned Psyker population grows year by year, with consequences that range from localized disasters to full demonic incursions that destroy those worlds entirely before any institutional response can arrive. Planetary governors on those cut-off worlds have been forced into improvisation. Some have established local training facilities, rough equivalents of the Scholastica Psychana's training regimens, constructed with whatever knowledge and materials are locally available and producing results that are inconsistent at best and catastrophic at worst. Some have simply begun executing identified Psykers rather than allowing the population to accumulate, which solves the immediate problem of potentially uncontrolled individuals at the cost of every potentially trainable asset. Some have lost control of the situation entirely, as the combination of more Psykers and longer intervals between collection-creating environments, where the institutional framework for managing psychic activity has broken down and something more organic and more dangerous has grown up in its place. The Imperium's response to this challenge is, characteristically, to try to do more of the same thing it has always done, harder and faster, more ships on more circuits, more holding facilities, more processing. The machine scaled up rather than fundamentally reconsidered, because fundamentally reconsidering a 10,000-year-old institution, while it is simultaneously necessary for the continued existence of civilization, is not a practical option in most governance frameworks, and especially not in the governance framework of the 41st millennium. And here is the thing that makes all of this, taken together, something that resists the ordinary categories of moral engagement. The machine is monstrous. This is not arguable. the systematic collection, imprisonment, transportation, and mass death or institutional servitude of human beings for the maintenance of a piece of psychic infrastructure is monstrous by any framework of ethics that assigns value to individual human lives and experiences. Every psyker in every hold is a person, completely and without qualification, and the machine does not treat them as one. The machine is also necessary. This is also not easily arguable within the internal logic of the setting. The alternative to the daily sacrifice is the Astronomicon going dark, and the alternative to the Astronomicon is the ships lost in the warp, and the alternative to the navigable warp is the Imperium's collapse. And the alternative to the Imperium, in a galaxy that also contains the tyrannid hive fleets and the servants of chaos, and the implacable mechanical hostility of the Necrons, and the casual expansionism of the Orcs, is something worse. The Imperium is not the best of all possible arrangements for human civilization. It is the only arrangement that keeps human civilization existing at all in its current configuration, and that arrangement requires this. The setting does not resolve this tension. It does not offer a solution, or a redemption arc, or a moment of institutional transformation that makes the machine humane. The machine runs, the ships sail, the beacon burns, the people are consumed, and the Imperium endures, because the alternative to endurance is annihilation, and annihilation ends even the modest possibility of better things that endurance leaves open. What Warhammer 40,000 does with this, uniquely among the settings that have tried to explore similar territory, is refuse to soften it. The system is not described with a wink that suggests the fiction understands it is too grim to be taken straight. The grimness is the point. The absence of a solution is structural, built into the setting's DNA at the level of its fundamental premises. There is no switch to throw that makes the Psyker tithe unnecessary. There is no reform that makes the black ships compassionate. There is no reformer within the Imperium positioned to change this, and if there were, the change they proposed would likely result in consequences worse than the system they were trying to fix, because the galaxy the system operates in does not permit the kind of safety margin that humane reform requires. In the grim darkness of the far future, the phrase says, "There is only war." Not just battles between armies. The war between the necessity of survival and the cost of that survival. The war between what the Imperium must do to exist and what it becomes by doing it. A war fought daily in the bodies and souls of people who were born with something they did not choose, in a civilization that needs that something and cannot afford to care about the people it comes with. 1,000 a day, 10,000 years, and somewhere in the outer reaches of a distant system, a child is waking up and finding that something is different this morning. Something is different about the way the air feels. But the family cat is watching from the corner with unusual intentness. In the kitchen, one of the ceramic cups that has stood on the shelf for as long as the child can remember has moved slightly, just a few centimeters, with no one near it. The child closes their hands around their own arms and tries to breathe slowly and wonders if anyone else noticed. Outside, in the outer system, something is approaching. The child does not know this yet, but the machine already does. This is the life of a Psyker in the Imperium of man. Not a dramatic life, in the way that space marines and primarchs lead dramatic lives. A quiet, grinding, systematic life of managed existence inside a machine so large that the people running it cannot see its full shape. A life defined by a gift that is also a curse, that is also a resource, that is also a sentence. This is what it means to be born different, in a universe that cannot afford to leave you free. I want to thank you for sitting with this one. It is a heavier topic than some, and the length is intentional because the machine we were talking about deserves the full weight of attention, rather than a summary that loses the texture of what it actually does to individual human lives. If this kind of deep exploration of the Warhammer 40,000 universe is why you are here, hitting that like button is genuinely what allows this kind of long-form content to keep being made. Subscribe to Q on 40,000 so that you do not miss whatever dark corner of the lore we move into next. Because the 41st millennium is full of places where the horror goes very still and very quiet and very deep. Until next time, the Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.